On live British television in 1981, a black woman in a sculpted jacket and impossible cheekbones sat on a talk show sofa and watched a white man turn his back on her. The cameras were still rolling. The host, Russell Hardy, swiveled away mid-question to address other guests behind her, as if she were part of the set. A glamorous lamp, a moving decoration. Every model in the world knew what was supposed to happen next. Smile, stay still, wait your turn. Grace Jones raised her hand and hit him. Once, twice, again. Not a playful tap, not a staged stunt. A series of sharp slaps that made the studio audience gasp and then laugh, that made Hardy's shoulders jolt under her palm. The clip would run for decades as evidence that she was crazy, dangerous, out of control. But look at it again, and it feels less like an outburst and more like a verdict. I will not be background. I will not be turned away from. That was the night the mask slipped, and the architecture underneath became visible. This was not just a model or a singer having a tantrum. This was the preacher's daughter from Jamaica who'd been told all her life to obey, to cover up, to stay small. Now slapping the rules of television, of race, of gender, in front of millions. The industry had been calling her too black, too masculine, too much, for years before that moment. The real question is why it took a slap on live TV for anyone to see that what they were really afraid of was not her temper, but her refusal to be an object ever again. To understand that hand coming down on Russell Hardy's back, you have to go a long way from the BBC studio, back to Spanish Town, Jamaica, 1948, before the nightclubs and the album covers, before the shoulder pads that looked like weapons. There was a little girl living in a house that belonged to God. Grace Beverly Jones entered a world of Pentecostal sermons and leather belts, of hymns sung loud enough to drown out any doubt. Her parents left for the United States to build a life, and she was raised mostly by her grandparents and a strict step-grandfather who believed the devil hid in lipstick, pop music, and anything that made a girl feel too pleased with herself. In that house, joy was rationed, and the body was a problem to be controlled. Sunday was not a soft day. It was inspection day. Dresses checked at the knee, collars squared, eyes lowered. Secular music was banned. Dance was suspect. A girl's knees were supposed to be hidden, her voice soft, her will broken in the name of salvation. Disobedience did not earn a conversation. It earned bruises. The belt hung where everyone could see it, a piece of leather that doubled as theology. Grace learned very early that her skin did not belong to her. It was something adults could strike when they felt called to correct her. It was something the church claimed as territory, to be covered, disciplined, denied. There is a particular kind of rage that grows in a child who is told that her desires are sinful before she has even had time to understand what they are. Grace sat through sermons about hellfire, about women who tempted men and paid the price. She listened to her elders talk about demons in the radio and vanity in the mirror, and somewhere under the fear, something in her refused. She has talked about sneaking tiny pieces of glamour into her life. A fragment of costume jewelry, a swipe of forbidden powder on her face, like a thief stealing fire from the altar. Each act was small, but the message was large. My body is mine, even if the rules say otherwise. In school plays, she gravitated to the loudest roles, the villains in Queens, anything that allowed her to stand in the center of the room for once and not be punished for it. The stage, even a makeshift one in a school hall, felt like the only place where raising her voice was not a crime. At 13, she was sent to join her parents in Syracuse, New York. For a lot of immigrant kids, that plane ride feels like an escape. It was more of a transfer. Her parents had become pastors. The rules crossed the ocean with them. Now the snow was different. They were Fallons. The houses were different. The accent was different, but the commandments were exactly the same. Skirts, long, mouth shut, secular music out of the question. What changed was what she could see. In Syracuse, she found fashion magazines, not in church, obviously, in drugstores, on coffee tables, in the homes of less devout relatives. She began tearing pages out of Vogue and pinning them on her bedroom wall. Saints of a new religion. Women whose bodies were not being punished, but photographed. Women whose faces did not apologize for taking up space. In a family where even listening to the wrong song could be grounds for discipline, a teenage girl quietly wallpapering her room with images of bare shoulders and smoky eyes was committing a kind of spiritual crime. At night, she would stand in front of the mirror and imitate their poses, testing how far she could push her own face into angles that scared her elders. It was rehearsal, not just for modeling, but for a life where her expression belonged to her. Grace's brother, Noel, chose the path the family understood. He would become Bishop Noel Jones. A respected preacher, Grace processed the same sermons and decided to run in the opposite direction. The discipline that had been used on her would become the engine of her defiance. If she was going to sin, she might as well do it properly. She skipped classes, fell in with drama kids and night owls, learned how to move through a room like she owned it even when she had no money and no plan. Church had trained her to memorize lines and perform belief. She would recycle that skill for a different audience. By 18, she was tall, thin, and unmistakable. 5'8", angles where other girls were soft, eyes that did not blink first. College brochures did not interest her. Respectable office jobs felt like another version of church. Rules, obedience, and no stage. She took the most direct route she could think of to those Vogue pages on her wall. She walked into Wilhelmina Models in New York with a handful of test shots and a body she already knew was controversial. The answer she got was simple and devastating. No, you don't fit. Not a problem with her walk or her posing. Not a suggestion to lose 5 pounds or grow out her hair. The issue was structural. In late 1960s America, fashion had a very narrow definition of sellable beauty, and a dark-skinned Jamaican girl with an angular face did not fit inside it. She was too black, too strong, too strange. Too much. The words might have been polite in the office, but Grace heard them clearly enough between the lines. She has talked about walking back out onto the Manhattan sidewalk after those meetings and feeling the sidewalks tilt. The city's glass towers throwing back an image of a girl who would never be the blonde on their billboards. A different kind of person might have tried to sand herself down to become more agreeable, more neutral. Grace did something far more dangerous. When New York said no, she did not beg. She bought a ticket. Paris, in the early 1972, was not a racial utopia, but it was, in its own way, more curious. The agencies there were just as blunt. One agent told her straight to her face, "You're too black. I can't sell you." Not, "You're ahead of your time." Not, "The market's not ready." Too black. As if her skin tone were a manufacturing defect. That sentence would become one of the main refrains of her life. Too black, too masculine, too much. In a world built on European standards, too black did not just mean, not our taste. It meant, your existence is a problem for our business model. For a young woman whose faith community had already told her that her desires were wrong, hearing the secular world say that her very shade was wrong hit a different nerve. It confirmed what colonization had whispered for centuries. There is a correct way to be visible, and you are not it. The thing about telling Grace Jones she is too anything is that it does not make her smaller, it makes her sharper. She moved into a cramped Paris apartment with 2 other young models who were also hustling for work. Jerry Hall, and Jessica Lange. Three future icons crammed into a space that smelled like cigarettes and cheap perfume, taking turns to make pasta and talk about jobs they almost got. At that point, none of them looked like destiny. They looked like three women trying not to give up. They shared clothes, shared tips, shared insecurities. On nights when there was no work, they would lean out of the tiny windows and watch the city light up, pointing out which billboards they'd like to replace one day. It is easy, years later, to treat this as a cute origin story. Three muses in a Paris garret. It was not cute at the time. The creation. It was not cute at the time. It was survival, splitting rent three ways and pretending not to see the fear in each other's faces. The breakthroughs, when they came slowly. A stylist took a chance on her for a show. Yves Saint Laurent called. Kenzo called. French magazines started to feel the heat of competition and looked for something, someone, that did not look like their last cover. In a room full of pale faces and safe smiles, Grace's bone structure and midnight skin suddenly did not look like a liability. They looked like the future. On paper, she was now doing what every young model dreams of, walking for couture houses, appearing in Elle and Vogue, going to fittings in studios where seamstresses addressed her as Mademoiselle. But she did not behave like a mannequin, and that is where the real story starts. Grace refused to let makeup artists lighten or narrow her features into something more palatable to white audiences. She brought her own clothes, hacked at hemlines, changed silhouettes. If a photographer asked for something soft, she gave them a pose that looked like a knife. There is a line that has been repeated about her by more than one photographer. You don't direct Grace Jones. You just try to keep up. In an industry built on obedience, on girls doing what they are told and suffering in silence. When they are not treated well, she was a problem. A thrilling, unnerving, intoxicating problem. She had discovered that if her body was going to be an object in front of the camera, she would be the one to decide what kind of object, not a vase, not a flower, but something closer to a weapon. The same body that had once been beaten into modesty was now being sharpened into a blade of glamour. Nightlife gave her a laboratory to test that idea. By the mid-1970 seconds, she was back and forth between Paris and New York, and there was one address in Manhattan that concentrated the entire decade into four walls. Studio 54. If the Pentecostal church of her childhood had been about suppressing the body, Studio 54 was about worshipping it, in sequins and sweat and white powder. Andy Warhol stood at the bar observing everyone. Mick Jagger and Bianca danced on tables. The line outside every night was a living sculpture of desperation and glamour. And there, at the center of the dance floor or on the tiny stage, there was Grace Jones. Getting inside was its own ritual. The doormen acted like priests, deciding who was worthy to enter the temple. Plenty of beautiful people were turned away on any given night. Grace walked up and the crowd parted, partly from recognition, partly from a sense that this was not someone you tried to stand in front of. She made an entrance the way other people inhaled. A tilt of the chin, a pause on the threshold, a slow survey of the room. And the room, predictably, rearranged itself around her. She was not just another famous face in the VIP section. She was part of the architecture of the club, as essential as the mirrored ball. The owners understood that when Grace walked in, the room changed. When she performed, it was less like a singer doing a set and more like a lightning storm. By then she had signed to Island Records. Modeling had given her a vocabulary of angles and silhouettes. Music would let her attach sound to that shape. Her cover of La Vie en Rose should, by the rules of good taste, have failed. A Jamaican former preacher's kid singing Edith Piaf in French over a languid disco groove. It sounds like a parody, But when she stepped onto a club stage in a towering headpiece, her body encased in an outfit that looked half armor, half sculpture, and opened her mouth, the song mutated. Her voice did not soar like Piaf's. It wrapped itself around the lyrics, low and commanding, making the words sound less like a plea and more like a spell. This was not romance. This was control. The persona hardened and sharpened. Grace Jones was no longer just a model who could sing. She was a force that made people in the room adjust their posture without realizing it. Her shows began to incorporate cages lowered from ceilings, dramatic reveals, live body painting. At one now legendary performance, artist Keith Haring painted her body on stage, turning her into a walking canvas. While the music pounded, and Warhol watched from the side, the roar of the crowd in those moments was addictive, but the come-down afterward, back in a dressing room with bad fluorescent lighting and smudged makeup, reminded her how fragile the spell could be. Take away the costume and the lights, and you were once again a woman in a chair, skin and bones and memories of Spanish Town. In most stories about muse and artist, the woman is the silent half of the duo. Grace refused that script. When she worked with Jean-Paul Goude, the graphic designer and photographer who became her lover and creative collaborator, she was not content to simply be his subject. Together they invented images that still look radical. Grace, in a sharp-shouldered suit and flat-top fade, cigarette dangling from her lips, Grace balanced on one foot, her body cut and rearranged in collage to exaggerate the geometry. Grace painted in tribal patterns, straddling the line between stereotype and confrontation. These images have rightly been criticized for the way they flirt with exoticism and the fetishizing of black bodies, but inside them there is also something else, a woman insisting on being the one who decides how she is seen. The power dynamics were complicated. With Problemin, this was still a white male artist framing a black female body, still a relationship that mixed tenderness, control, creativity, and damage. Grace has spoken about both the thrill of that collaboration and the ways it broke her. The photographs made them both famous, but she was the one who had to walk around in the skin the world now projected its fantasies onto. The irony was violent. The same industry that had called her too black to sell now lined up to exploit her blackness as a fashion statement. The same culture that had called her too masculine to be desirable now plastered her androgyny on billboards. Grace was not naive about this. She knew she was being commodified. She also understood that she could turn that transaction to her advantage if she never forgot where the power came from, not from their approval, but from her refusal to behave. This is the context you need to fully grasp why. In 1981, on a BBC set decorated like a polite living room, she did not sit quietly when Russell Hardy turned his back. Every model in the world knew the unwritten rules of television. You laugh at the host's jokes. You let him interrupt you. You wait, smiling, while he attends to more important guests. The host's swivel was not an accident. It was a gesture soaked in entitlement. I can literally and figuratively turn away from you, and you will keep shining for my audience when I decide to come back. Grace Jones, who had spent 2 decades being told she was too much, and then being begged to be too much on cue, read that swivel for exactly what it was. So she raised her hand and answered back, in the only language television could not edit in the moment. Contact. The slap was not elegant. It was messy, repetitive, a little shocking even to people who loved her. But under the chaos was a precise message. I am not a backdrop. I will not decorate your neglect. The tabloids labeled her insane and dangerous. British talk show hosts quietly reevaluated whether to invite her. But for a generation of viewers who had ever watched a black woman be spoken over, a part of the brain lit up. Oh, that is what it looks like when someone refuses to duck. If the early 1,980 seconds were the peak of her visibility, They were also the start of the long bill coming due. She moved into film, Conan the Destroyer, Conan the Destroyer, where her character looked like someone the barbarian should fear, not rescue. A View to a Kill, where her Mayday made James Bond look suddenly fragile. The camera adored her and was slightly afraid of her. That was the point. She was playing versions of the persona she had built, the woman who could walk into any frame and tilt it off its axis. Meanwhile, the British and American press gorged themselves on describing her with words they would never use. For white actresses, Amazonian, savage, unnatural. The same sharp cheekbones that made designers gasp were used as evidence that she was somehow less feminine, less human. Publicly, she laughed it off. Privately, it added another layer to the armor. Behind the frames, the life holding that persona up was fraying. Cocaine, which had been as normal as champagne in the clubs of the 1,970 seconds, did not stay a harmless accessory. It crawled into daylight, in the mid-1,980 seconds, during a trip to Jamaica that was supposed to be a rest. She was arrested on suspicion of drug possession and spent nights in a cell insisting she did not use. The lab eventually agreed with her. The charges were dropped, but the shock of handcuffs on wrists that had been used to holding microphones and champagne flutes broke something open. Rehab followed. Coming down is never glamorous. The nights in glittering rooms give way to mornings of sweats and tremors, to long meetings where strangers talk about surrender. Grace did the unglamorous work of staying alive, and, as she sobered up, another form of exploitation came into view with sickening clarity. Her accountant, the person paid to keep track of the money her face and body had earned, had been stealing from her. Taxes were unpaid, accounts were drained. The empire she appeared to rule from magazine covers had been quietly hollowed out. Part of her feared that if she let go of the drugs, she would also let go of the persona that the fearless Grace Jones people wanted was, in part, chemically armored. Learning that the bravest move might be to be clear-eyed and afraid was an inversion of everything the image demanded. At the same time, a quieter, more devastating catastrophe was unfolding. AIDS turned the shining world she had danced through into a battlefield. Dancers, designers, stylists, lovers, friends, the men who had shared her cigarettes in club bathrooms and adjusted her hemline before she stepped on stage, began to disappear. One funeral, then another, then another. The flicker of lighters in the dark at Studio 54 was replaced, in her memory, by the flicker of candles at memorial services. I was depressed for 2 years watching many of my friends die. She said later, as if 2 years were a modest number. There is no glamour in watching hospital corridors fill with people who once looked invincible under stage lights, for a woman who had constructed herself as larger than life. This was the true tragedy. Not the arrest, not the bad press, but the shrinking of her world. The stage got bigger, the cast got smaller. The body that had once been the site of rebellion was now a source of fear, whose blood, whose fluids, whose kiss could cost you everything. The same culture that had happily consumed queer creativity suddenly wanted distance from the people who provided it. Grace watched that hypocrisy up close. The industry was terrified of being associated with the epidemic, but addicted to the aesthetic invented by those who were dying from it. Somewhere in that period, long after the headlines about her temper and her costumes had faded from page 1, a child's voice cut through the noise. Her son, Paulo, he asked her why she did not laugh anymore. It is one thing to be called too much by agents and journalists. It is another to be called not enough by your own child. That question forced her to consider a different kind of control, not just over how the world saw her, but over whether she wanted to be here, to see her son grow up. There are stories of her standing at the sink washing dishes. Of all things, The woman who once descended from club ceilings in a cage, now doing the most ordinary domestic chore, and realizing that survival might mean choosing more. Of these small, quiet moments and fewer all-night storms, she began to pull back from the edge. The 1,990 seconds found her moving more slowly between Paris, New York, and Jamaica, picking her projects, saying no more often. She dipped into acting classes, recorded when she felt like it, practiced yoga, rediscovered the version of herself that existed off stage. For the first time since she'd left Spanish Town, there were stretches of days where no one was taking her picture. She took Paulo to school, argued with him about homework, cooked, slept. The discipline that had once been used to keep her in church was now used to keep her alive on her own terms. She also made a choice that surprised people who thought they knew what kind of woman Grace Jones was. In 1996, she married Attila Altaonbay, a much younger Turkish-born bodyguard, in a private ceremony. For a while, the marriage looked like a different kind of fantasy, the warrior with a protector, the intimidating icon with someone to stand just behind her, arms folded. But the same dynamics that had made her allergic to control in the fashion world appeared inside her home. Attila became possessive, jealous, unpredictable. Grace, who had carved a career out of refusing to be handled, found herself once again having to decide how much of her body and time belonged to someone else. She left. Legally, the marriage was never fully tidied up. On paper, they are still connected. In reality, the woman who refused to be background on a TV sofa refused to be background in her own kitchen. There were still flashes of the old provocateur. In 1998, she performed at a Disney World event and bared her breasts on stage. The company banned her for life. For a corporation built on cartoon mice and princesses, the sight of a black woman in her 40s owning her body on their stage was a problem they could not file under family entertainment. Grace shrugged. If a theme park that sells branded fantasies could not handle a human woman being human, that said more about them than about her. While she recalibrated, the culture quietly moved in her direction. Pop stars started experimenting with androgyny and shock tactics. Fashion editorials filled up with references to silhouettes and poses she had pioneered. Younger artists studied her album covers and videos like blueprints. Magazines ran Grace-inspired shoots. It was flattering and infuriating in equal measure. The woman who had been told she was unsellable now watched watered-down versions of her image fly off the shelves. You could see her ghost in everything from Madonna's cone bras to Lady Gaga's masked entrances, in Rihanna's sharp-shouldered suits, and in 100 pop videos where a female body stalks across the frame like a predator instead of prey. The industry had finally decided that too much was profitable, as long as it was attached to faces they found easier to manage. In 2008, nearly 2 decades after her last studio album, she released Hurricane. She was 60. On paper, that should have been a nostalgia project, a polite victory lap. It was not. The record sounded like a woman who had walked through every room the culture had to offer and returned with a scalpel. Corporate cannibal, in particular, felt like a manifesto. Her face stretched and morphed in the video, swallowing and spitting out the words, "I'm a man-eating machine," as if she were cheerfully confessing to having seen the inside of the system and deciding to eat it instead. There was no attempt to sound young. There was only the sound of someone who had survived long enough to be honest. 4 years later, in 2012, she delivered an image that tied every thread of her story into one improbable knot. At Queen Elizabeth II's Diamond Jubilee concert, Grace Jones stepped onto a British stage in a corseted outfit and towering headpiece, a gold hula hoop in her hands. She was 64. She set the hoop spinning around her waist and began to sing "Slave to the Rhythm." For nearly 4 minutes, she kept it going. No drop, no stumble, The camera kept cutting from her face, painted, amused, controlled, to the blur of the hoop. In a country that had once watched her slap a talk show host in horror, millions now watched her command a royal celebration by doing something no one else on that bill could do. It was a stunt. Yes, it was also a statement. This body, the one you called too black and too masculine and eventually too old, does not obey your expiry dates. It was the inverse of her childhood Sundays. Back then, the body had to be covered, contained, punished. Now it was the engine of the spectacle, the proof that she, not the rules, would decide when she was finished. In 2015, she published a memoir with the self-contradictory title, "I'll Never Write My Memoirs." Inside, she laid out her versions of the stories people thought they knew, and added new ones they had never heard. She also aimed a clean, sharp line at the generation of pop stars who had walked through doors she helped kick open. Madonna, Lady Gaga, Rihanna, Miley Cyrus. She saw herself in their work, and she saw a difference. "I am the blueprint," she wrote, not bragging but pointing to receipts. She accused the new wave of confusing costume with risk, of mistaking marketing plans for rebellion. "They dress as if they are challenging the status quo," she wrote. "But in wearing those clothes, they are not challenging. They are conforming. Coming from anyone else, that might have sounded like jealousy. From a woman who had slapped a host, yelled at photographers and stared down executives long before it was a hashtag. It landed more like an audit. In 2018, the circle bent back to where it had begun. The government of Jamaica awarded her the Order of Jamaica, one of the nation's highest honors. The girl who had been beaten for wanting to wear makeup, who had been told in Paris that she was too black to sell, stood on a stage in the country of her birth, and was thanked for the very things she had once been punished for. Her defiance, her spectacle, her refusal to be simple. Somewhere in the crowd were girls who had grown up seeing dark skin in beauty campaigns for the first time, who had never been told out loud that they were too black to sell, but had felt the echo of that sentence in 1,000 small exclusions. Today, Grace Jones lives in the in-between. She is a grandmother who melts when she talks about her granddaughter, and she is still the woman who can terrify a room just by walking into it a beat later than everyone expects. She performs when she feels like it. She disappears when she wants to. She moves between Paris and Jamaica, between past and present, between icon and individual. The battles over her body have quieted, but they have not disappeared. Journalists still ask invasive questions. Commenters still refer to her in the present tense as if she were a concept, not a human being. What she has, finally, is something close to what she always demanded: control over where she stands. And when she speaks, Grace Jones did not simply break the rules of fashion and music. She revealed them, who they were written for, who they were written against, and how fragile they become when someone refuses to obey. She took every too black, every too masculine, every too much, and turned them into armor. The industry that once said it could not sell her now sells diluted versions of her image to teenagers who have never heard her name. The culture that once called her frightening now quietly studies her to figure out how to make the next big thing. The preacher's granddaughter who was told to sit down and be quiet has outlived multiple eras that tried to package and tame her. But if you listen closely to her story, the question is not whether she won. She did. The question is what happens next to the people who try to walk in her footsteps. Somewhere right now there is a girl who has been told she is too dark, too tall, too loud, too angular. Maybe she is staring at a magazine cover or a TikTok feed, instead of a Vogue torn out and taped to a wall. Maybe she has seen the clip of Grace slapping Russell Hardy and laughed, without fully knowing why it feels like justice. The space that Grace carved out, the space for women, especially black women, to be scary and glamorous and respected all at once, is real. It exists. But it is narrow, and it is still booby-trapped. The same stereotypes that once called grace unfeminine now show up as school dress codes, workplace, professionalism, algorithms that decide whose faces get recommended and whose get ignored. So when we replay that 1981 slap, or the hula hoop at the Jubilee, or the body painted by Keith Haring, we should ask ourselves a harder question than, wasn't she iconic? We should ask, are we treating Grace Jones as a one-off spectacle that lets us keep the system the same, or as a crack in the facade that we are willing to widen? When the next woman walks onto a stage or into a boardroom or onto a runway with a body you have been taught to call too much, will you secretly wait for her to fail so you can feel safer inside the old rules? Or will you finally admit that if those rules can be shattered by a single raised hand on live television, perhaps they were never worth obeying in the first place?